Welcome to the History Nerds Night podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have Noah Rothbaum, the Whiskey Bible. It is exactly what you think it is. It's absolutely fantastic. We wanted to get this episode out before the holiday season. If you have someone in your family who loves whiskey, you have to get this book. If you have a coffee table, if you have a home bar, you want this book sitting there. It's gorgeous. It's fun. You pick it up, read a couple pages, put it back down. It's fantastic. It's such a big deal to do this episode that there's actually two special guests that join us. These two special guests further prove that I make terrible decisions, but that's neither here nor there right now, okay? How about I just shut up? Let's talk to Noah. And here we are with author Noah Rothbaum, The Whiskey Bible, a complete guide to the world's greatest spirit. Noah, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so I really appreciate being on it and talking history. Anytime I can talk history with people who want to talk history, I'm always excited.
The book is fantastic, and I can't wait to talk about it. But as I said, thank you for coming on, and also I am so sorry because this is a somewhat experimental episode. We have producer Mike Bowman. Mike, say hello to the people.
Hello, people.
And YouTube, Michael Barnett.
Hello, everybody.
So the three of us are History Nerds United. I'm usually the interviewer, but as I told you before we hit record, they heard whiskey and said, we're in, it's time to do it. I don't know how this is going to go. I do feel like this may be the biggest mistake of my life, but I appreciate you coming on this journey with us. I want to start off with the first question because as I'm reading this, just looking at it, it's gorgeous. I looked at it, I said, the only way a person can look at this in their mind and think about it and say, I'm going to write the Whiskey Bible, it's one of two things, extreme self-confidence or total hubris. Which one led you to write the Whiskey Bible?
Well, I mean, if I'm going to be totally honest, when Workman approached me, a publisher, obviously they put out the Wine Bible about 25 years ago now, and Wine Bible is an incredibly important book, very, very big footsteps for me to follow in. I was a little nervous, right? You know, it's like, wow, like, do I really want to write the Whiskey Bible? Like, that's going to be a giant project to take on. I was still in the home stretch of wrapping up my last book, the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails, which is an even bigger book, if you can believe it, which I'd worked on for about 8 years. I was the associate editor of that with David Wondrich, who's, the cocktail historian. He was the editor-in-chief of that book, and he worked on it for 10 years. I only worked on it for 8. And I was just a little bit like, oh God, like, do I really want to take on the Whiskey Bible? Like, and then I was like, this is too good of an opportunity to pass up. And I had to say yes, right? I mean, I just, only a few opportunities like this coming along in a lifetime if you're lucky, right? So I was smart enough to come to my senses and took it. And then, you go into, work mode, right? Like, well, how am I going to do this, right? And the only way to do something like this is kind of break it down into like bite-sized pieces that you can like wrap your mind around. Because if you think about it, like in totality, even now it's retroactively terrifying to me to say like, yeah, you got to write over 600 pages. So yeah, at first I was like, will I have enough? And then at a certain point in this project, my editors were like, hey, no more. Like this is too much. Like we're like challenging the technology of binding books. So like, slow your roll here, buddy. I don't know. You have to have a little bit of hubris, I think, to take on this. And hopefully I haven't flown too close to the sun.
Well, you have not, because I think it's important to, first of all, point out that you did an amazing job. Like we talked right before we hit record, like, you shouldn't try and read it in one plane ride. That's a lot. You can take this in bits and pieces. But besides nailing this book, you are also an extremely generous human being because right now, the three of us at History Nerds United are drinking whiskey that you sent ahead of time. I can guarantee you the first time that this has happened, I haven't bought drinks after interviewing people. Right. Never before. You killed it.
Thanks,
we appreciate it.
Yeah, it's very much appreciated.
It was my pleasure. You told me that this was kind of going to be like a cocktail hour holiday party, right?
Sure it is.
Kind of party.
Cheers.
And also, to be honest, I think everything through the lens of whiskey is more interesting, right? Whether it's chemistry, lawsuits, congressional records, but it's even more interesting if you're actually drinking whiskey. So, and we're drinking, some of my favorites here. So we have a special release from Bourbon, which is the 12-year-old whiskey, which is their new one, the Heart of the Harbor, which just came out. It's part of Diageo special releases. I love Bourbon. It's like, it's from the west coast of Scotland, so it has just like a little bit of that peaty maritime, but it's not like I'm going to hit you over the head with smoke and peat. It's just like a whisper. And this one, I don't know, there's like a little bit of a raisin note, like what they call in Scotland sultanins, right? Like just a little bit of sweetness. And then we also have, because I wasn't sure if you'd like Scotch or if you'd like bourbon or American whiskey. So I sort of split the difference with the Bulleit single malt, which is a fairly new bottling from Bulleit. Obviously, they're famous for their bourbon and rye, but the single malt is made like Scotch from malted barley, but it's made sort of in an American style. So it's aged in American new oak, and it's made on, a column still that we use in America. So, I thought, okay, these are two things that would be good to bring. I mean, we're talking about the book, the single malt category, the federal government, the U.S. federal government, finally, after years of debate, finally decided almost exactly a year ago, like right before the end of the year, last year, they finally settled on a definition, and the book was just going to print. So, I mean, this bottle is a little bit triggering because there's this one frantic moment where it's like, oh my God, the federal government has finally decided what the regulations are going to be for American single malt. This is a new category. And I had to frantically email my editor and be like, stop the process. We got to revise this one page of the American whiskey chapter. And thankfully it wasn't that big of a change. And my editor was incredibly gracious. And she was like, yeah, of course, just get that to me. But it was one of these things that we're just able to slide right under the wire to ensure that the book is not immediately out of date and accurate. And then I was like, please, everybody in the liquor industry, in the whiskey industry, no more mergers, no more acquisitions, no more trading brands, no more major launches, please, until at least next late fall, winter, please. So, unfortunately, there haven't been, knock on wood, hasn't been too much crazy news, big news where, something like Seagram's, selling its assets or nothing like that has happened yet. So the book is still totally accurate as far as I know. So,
yeah. And so I think you touched on it before when you talked about undertaking the book, right? Whiskey can be very polarizing. Everybody has their own take. What's the best whiskey? What region does it come from? Is it Scottish? Is it Irish? Is it American? Is it Canadian whiskey? But we're not going to count that. And I'm going to put you on the spot right now. What, in your opinion, is the best whiskey in the world, and why isn't it Bulleit Rye?
Wow, well, I'm going through a tunnel, so I lost you there. So we'll just skip to the next question. No, I guess
it's Noah. It's
sorry,
not.
My car phone.
It's
my
not
car
like
just cut
it's
out.
not like
I'm
you
so
started
sorry.
this. It's not like you started the book off saying, "Don't ask me that."
Look, everybody. I put in the beginning of the book, that's the worst question because it's the question everyone wants to know, but it's very hard. I don't disagree with you. Bulleit Rye, I think, is a fantastic product. And to be honest, years ago when I started writing about drinks, 25 years ago, there was no rye. Rye was the Yeti, right? There were a lot of sightings, unconfirmed sightings, but you could never get a bottle. You never see a photo of it. You go to a liquor store, oh, I'm sorry, we just sold out. And for years, even in New York, if you asked in Manhattan, if you went to a fancy bar and you said, oh, I'd like a rye Manhattan, they'd be like, of course, no problem. And they'd reach for a bottle of Canadian Club, right? And yes, a lot of Canadian whiskeys use rye grain, but at that time, there were none of them that were making 100% or straight rye as we would define it, or 100% rye. And now there are. So Bulleit Rye was really the brand that broke it all open, right? It's the one that made, was finally accessible. I mean, at the time, people who were making rye, the few brands, you know how often they would make rye?
I don't.
One day a year. So Heaven Hill would do it one day a year. Everybody hated Rye Day. They'd have to find the recipe. All of the mid-Atlantic states that were famous for producing rye, by 30 years ago, all of those brands had disappeared. A few of their, the intellectual property, the brand names had been bought by some of the bourbon brands. And you had folks like Wild Turkey, Heaven Hill, and they were making rye like really one day a year. And that was more than enough to satisfy the demand. It was literally on life support, circling the drain. You couldn't get it anywhere. Finally, thanks to like the rebirth of the cocktail in the late 90s, early 2000s, all of these craft bartenders were like, we want rye whiskey. We need rye whiskey. And Bullet, I remember when they were thinking about launching the rye, my friend at the time, she told the brand manager, she was a well-known bartender and bar like consultant, and they were like, do you think that this is enough rye? And she was like, no, you need to make more. Like, we need more. And they were like, really? And she was like, absolutely, you're not going to have a problem selling. And she was totally right, Aisha Sharp. And the brand manager at the time was a woman named Trish Mannion, and she listened. And Bullet Rye blew up because all of these craft bars around the country were like, we need rye whiskey. Like, we need it for Manhattans. We need it for old fashions. We need it for all of our drinks. Because rye, like, the difference between rye and bourbon, if you notice, I'm kind of filibustering not to answer your question, but that's
I know what you're doing.
And nailing it.
Bourbon has to be at least 51% corn. And then there's a little bit of malted barley, which helps with the fermentation process, right? Because barley is like, it's the Wolverine of grains. Like, it belongs in the X-Men because it has its own enzymatic powers to convert its starches to sugars. I was the world's worst chemistry student, so it's hilarious that I have to talk about this for a living. But basically, to make booze, you want sugar. You don't want starch, right? It's easier to make booze out of sugar. So barley essentially can turn its own starches to sugar if it thinks it's about to grow. So for malted barley, essentially, we're tricking it. We're wetting it. So it's like, oh, I'm about to like turn into a plant. But before it actually starts growing and uses up all those wonderful sugars, we bake it, right, to essentially shut that off. So we add a little bit of malted barley, and then most bourbon is made with rye. Some are made with wheat, like as a wheated bourbon, like Maker's Mark or Weller or Pappy Van Winkle. Rye, on the other hand, has to be at least 51% rye, right? And it can be 100% rye. It can be 95% rye, 5% malted barley, which a famous distillery in Indiana now called MGP, which has been built by Seagram's, that's their recipe, the 95.5, and a lot of brands use that 95.5. So rye has like been on a crazy rebirth, but you know how often most people make rye today, even after all of this?
2 days.
1 day a month, right? So, they're still making bourbon 24/7, 365. Rye gets so much press and buzz, right? And love. I mean, I love it, but in reality, in the real world, it's still a very, very small amount compared to the totality of bourbon production in America, right? So obviously listeners should go out, try rye. Rye is spicier, it's more unctuous, it's more oily, it's a bigger flavor. It works really well in cocktails because it doesn't get lost, right? You add sweet vermouth to make a Manhattan. The Manhattan's the easiest drink to remember how to make. Most of us are New Yorkers, right? Or former New Yorkers, right? The original area code for New York City was 212. Now it's just for Manhattan. So basically the recipe for the Manhattan is 212. 2 parts whiskey, 1 part sweet vermouth, 2 drops of bitters, usually Angostura bitters. It's super easy to remember. You stir it on ice until it's cold and you drink it. And rye works really, really well with sweet vermouth and doesn't get lost and you get that spiciness. The book has hundreds and hundreds of brands mentioned, right? But really, I mean, there's so many wonderful whiskeys. I mean, it's sort of impossible to narrow it down, but I would say, these 2 are great ones. I love basically everything that Michter's makes. Their whiskeys are so good. George Dickel, like their bourbon is like unbelievably delicious and like, I don't know, $30 a bottle. The old Overhalt, the Bonded is really good. We're living truly in a golden age, right?
A couple decades ago, I had my very first taste of whiskey at, you guessed it, Brendan Dowd's house. And as a younger person 2 decades ago, it's all about the chasers. It's all about the mixers because, you haven't refined the palate quite yet. What's the most unusual mixer or chaser that you've encountered kind of as you've explored this world?
That is a good question. And to answer that, I'm going to say first, I don't really believe, I mean, this sounds crazy for somebody who wrote a book called The Bible, but I truly believe that people should drink whiskey any way that they enjoy it, right? Like, it's not my job to shame you or tell you, like, you shouldn't mix whiskey with this or that. In fact, when Scotch becomes popular in America, originally at the turn of the century, it becomes popular because of two trends. One is a new game that's a sensation called golf, right? Americans fall hard for golf. And the second thing that they fall for is highballs, which is just Scotch and club soda, right? Still a delicious drink. You make highballs with, brandy, cognac, but with all types of whiskey, tastes amazing. If you go to Japan today, Japan is crazy for highballs. And they usually do 4 parts club soda, 1 part whiskey. Depending upon what you like, you can change that ratio, but it's a wonderful drink. You could also use ginger beer, ginger ale, right? That's also a great drink. But, if you want to drink Mountain Dew and Macallan, okay, like the only question should be from a bartender is, do you want that on the rocks? Do you want crushed ice? Do you want a sphere? You want a garnish, right? To your question, though, I love that people, when they drink whiskey, that it's not only a reflection of the people who make it, right, and the place where it comes from, which each bottle is essentially like a time capsule, right, and a little bit of that place and those people. But then I love when people, wherever they live, they then incorporate into their own culture and customs, right? So, like in places like China, sometimes people drink whiskey with green tea, right, which is crazy, right? It's amazing, right? Why not? It's like, so all these combinations, I mean, that's the history of cooking and food and drinks, is that these things bounce around the world, right? And people adapt it and to their own customs and their own recipes, and they evolve. And suddenly it's like, wow, that's really good. And we never would have thought about them. And like, you have like things like the Negroni and all of the kind of Italian cocktails where, at the time, Italians would never have mixed sweet vermouth with bitters like Campari, right? But leave it to Americans, like where...
USA! USA!
Right, exactly. And bartenders, I like to say, are both professional and amateur role, but mostly professional, right? They're very curious, they're very creative, and there's a lot of downtime with the job, right? So they're sitting there and they're thinking, okay, like, how do I mix up something cool and unique? And what we see is like the first definition in print for a cocktail comes from a newspaper in upstate New York, in Hudson, New York, in 1806. An editor had written an article, or the editor had written an article where he referred to cocktail, like a cocktail, 2 words at the time. And the following week, somebody had written in and said, last week you used the word cocktail. What does that mean? And the editor wrote back, it's basically a stimulating mixture of spirits, water, sugar, and bitters, right? Which is essentially an old fashioned, right? So old fashioned is the cocktail, right? It begets all these other drinks. You basically add sweet vermouth, which comes to America in the late 1800s from France and Italy. You get a Manhattan, right? You add absinthe, right? A little bit of it. You get the Sazerac, right? You add club soda, so you get a highball. You know what I mean? So like basically all this is to say that all of the cocktails we have come from people experimenting and adding all types of amazing, ingredients to their drink that nobody else had done before, right? And when you look back, like it's only a relatively new idea that these things are like codified, right? Where recipes are fixed, they're chiseled into stone, right? Like you cannot make your drink with anything but this, right? Where that's not the history of bartending, right? If that was true, we'd have like 3 cocktails, right? And necessity is also the mother of invention, where a lot of stories, again, for historians and folks like us, this is an oral history, right? And it's also a history often told over drinks in very loud bars, right? Where people are yelling. If they write it down, they shove it in their pocket, and the next morning they're like, what did I write on this thing? What's that drink called? Or they're yelling it over a bar. So you get all these amazing names. And I remember once when I was running the Daily Beast Half Full section, I had Dave Wondrich write a story about all the references to the martini. And it's amazing how many slight variations on the word martini are found in newspaper articles and books and reference to, because truly I think somebody's yelling over a thing and they're like, what'd you say? Martinez? Okay, here you go. Like, and the recipes are like, sometimes they have more vermouth than booze. They sometimes have sweet vermouth and dry vermouth and booze. The martini and the Manhattan are essentially the same drink. I know that for a lot of people, that's an uncomfortable realization. Like, wait, what? Like, people are either martini drinkers or they're Manhattan drinkers, right? But it's really essentially the same recipe, right? And over time, through experimentation, they evolve. So you're right, Michael. I mean, it's people are introducing all types of things to their whiskey. And to be honest, I kind of love it. Like, do I love all of the drinks that are created or every drink that I've ever been served in, say, cocktail competitions or in bars around the world? I mean, a lot of them are interesting, right? The golden rule for me, whether I'm drinking whiskey neat or in a cocktail, is the question, do I want a second glass?
Amen.
And a lot of people think, oh, my palate, like it's not sophisticated enough, or like nobody goes into a fine restaurant and tells a chef that, right? And says, don't waste your fancy food on me. Like I'm just like a humble eater. No, you're like, I want the truffles and the foie gras and all the, give me everything, right? I think it's the same thing with whiskey. It's that like, it shouldn't matter if this is your first one or you've been drinking for 10 years. Like if you like it, you like it. If you don't like it, you don't like it. I mean, sometimes there are things that I don't like and then I come back a few years later and I like them. But again, I mean, I think it's, if you don't like it, then don't drink it, right? Don't drink it because you think it's going to impress me or Brendan. Certainly don't drink it if you think it's going to impress Brendan.
I love that.
Correct.
Just drink what you like.
To live by. That is
you're
to
in,
live.
Noah. You're in. 100%.
Well,
Cheers to you.
Well, Noah, it's you brought up wine and just talking about going into a fancy restaurant. One of the things that I thought about, especially looking through the book, is when you talk to real wine connoisseurs, what do they call it? Winos. When you talk to winos and you say, do you
That's the Latin, I think.
Yes. Do you have to get a fancy wine to get a good version of wine? Is it the same with whiskey? Because anybody who really does know wine will say, no, you don't have to drop $2,000.
Right, I agree with that. The funny thing with wine is that, like, I mean, I once wrote a story about this. The front label is less important than the back label because there are all these specialty importers who basically do all the hard work for you. So folks like Louis Dresner Selections, Skurnick, Polliner, Kermit Lynch. So if you're at a fancy restaurant, don't even open the wine list. Say to the sommelier, I really like the wines from Kermit Lynch or Louis Dresner. If they know what they're doing, they will look at you with newfound respect. They'll be like, what? And you're like, yeah, I love their wines. And their wines start at like, I think Louis Dresner's wine started at $6. Like they're like Signature Chablis is like a $15 bottle in a store. And it's incredibly good. And I've done this at like several like very, very famous restaurants. And people are like, oh my God, you like those types of wines? I'm like, yeah. And you're like, okay, like my wife and I were once in Gramercy Tavern and I said this, we had this conversation with someone and they were like, we have this one unfiltered, like sparkling wine. People order it and then they're weirded out because it's kind of cloudy. And we're like, bring it. It was like $60 a bottle, which for that kind of restaurant is a screaming deal. The wine was incredibly good, right? And all the sommeliers thought we were the coolest people in the whole place, right? So you're more than like free to copy that trick. Sometimes the sommelier will be like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's maybe a place to order beer. You know what I mean? Because if they don't know what you're talking about, that's not a good sign, right? Because these are like, this is like kind of like you've given them the cool kid handshake by asking for these types of wines. And again, they don't cost that much. And they're really, really high quality, and they're usually made with like very traditional techniques. It's kind of the same with whiskey. I mean, everybody thinks that like, if it's more expensive or it's older, I'm gonna like it more. I mean, if it was that easy, I wouldn't have to write the whiskey book. Oh, right. So like just because a whiskey is much more expensive or much older than the one that you drink, even if it's the same brand, you won't necessarily like the more expensive one more or the older one more. I mean, I think with both wine and spirits, it's often a self-fulfilling prophecy because if you drop several $100s, several $1,000s, God help us, tens of thousands of dollars on a whiskey, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because that will be the best whiskey you've ever had because it better be the best whiskey you've ever had if you paid that much money. But in reality, that's the hard thing is that like why these whiskeys are so expensive is that sometimes it has to do with very, very practical matters, right? Like there's a thing called angel share, which is a fancy way, very romantic way of talking about evaporation. So when the barrel is filled, it goes into the warehouse full, but over time, depending upon where you are in the world, there's a rate of evaporation, right? The angels are, either more thirsty or less thirsty, but obviously in hotter climates, more humid climates, there's more evaporation. But over time, no matter where you are, by the time you go to bottle the whiskey, you're not going to have that many bottles. You're going to have fewer bottles than you started out with, essentially, of spirit. So you're paying for that. You're paying for taxes. You're paying for warehousing. You're paying for maintenance. You're paying for all these very practical things. So there's real reason why the whiskey's expensive. And you're paying for rarity. Sometimes like a whiskey from a distillery that's no longer around called ghost barrels. Like these ghost barrels are incredibly valuable because the distillery is gone. Really cool story. Amazing back, story for these things, which is a lot of what you're paying for. Does that mean that you will like it? Who knows? That is,
right.
So again, like a good bartender, right? If you said, look, I usually drink X brand, this is like my go-to, I really like it. Can you recommend something that you think I'll like? And somebody good will be able to say, absolutely. Like, if you like this, let me turn you on to these other whiskeys that you might like. Because either a similar, mash bill, which is just essentially the amount of grain in it, or the type of barrel it's aged in, or the flavor profile. So it's not that hard. I mean, I have a friend, Bernie Lubbers, who for many years was a brand ambassador at Jim Beam and then at Heaven Hill. And he would, at whiskey festivals, he totally freaked people out because they'd come up and he'd be like, what's your favorite bourbon? And they'd tell him, and then he'd be like, oh, you also like blah, 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 blah. And they'd be like, how did you know that? Like, that's spot on, because there aren't that many recipes for making bourbon. So if he knew that it had this flavor profile, he had a pretty good idea that they probably like these three other ones. But it was something that most regular consumers would not have put together, that why they like these four brands is because they have very similar recipes, right? Like they would just, that would be lost on them. But in the back end, you're like, it's a very similar whiskey. Obviously the end result is slightly different, and so again, I mean, I think that's the type of thing where, a good bartender or a good liquor store would be able to help you navigate that, right? And some places you don't need to get a 2-ounce pour. You can get a 1/2-ounce pour or a 1/4-ounce pour, right? And sometimes that's a fun way to try things that you've never tried before. Just totally go out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, I actually think you hit the nail on the head, because I have tried a lot of whiskeys. I'm a whiskey drinker, right? And I've been very lucky to try some pretty expensive whiskeys, right? But my palate goes back to that $38 bottle of Bullet Rye every single time, and it hits the right notes, it hits the right spot, and it's absolutely delicious.
I mean, it's funny because we're so trained to think that more expensive is better that sometimes I'll do a tasting and I'll pour something like Rittenhouse or some of the Glenlivets or Bullet, right? And somebody in the thing will be like, they'll admit after the class or the tasting will say, I would never have picked that bottle, but I love it. And be like, why wouldn't you have picked it? And I'm like, it's too cheap. It's too reasonable. I'm like, wait, what do you mean? They're like, well, I've been wasting my money basically on whiskeys that cost a lot more, because I thought that to get a certain level of quality, you'd have to spend more. And the real answer is that the big brands, they've been in business for so long, is because they make usually very high quality products, right? So I mean, one of the shortcuts or hacks for picking whiskey is most of the big brands actually make very, very high quality stuff. I mean, your joke aside about Wild Turkey, I mean, Wild Turkey, Russell's Reserve, I mean, not that long ago, it was the punchline to a lot of jokes. But in the last 20 years, people were like, wow, Wild Turkey is actually a really good product. And it's very hard to find a whiskey that's better than Wild Turkey that costs it costs $15, $20
20
a bottle.
bucks. Yeah.
Unbelievable value, right? So unreal that they would be able to produce that high quality of a whiskey at that price, right? And it's just because it's economies of scale and they've been doing it so long. And some of these brands, it's sometimes my fault. I'm like, look, you got to raise the price. Like, I know it sounds ridiculous, but you're turning off certain people because if it's too cheap, they're not going to think it's good. But like, unlike, I don't know, maybe watches or sports cars, some of the more expensive stuff in our industry, you're often paying for like marketing. You're not actually paying for the quality of the whiskey, which is totally counterintuitive, makes whiskey drinking super fun, right? Because the stuff sometimes on the bottom shelf is actually really good. I mean, as long as it's straight whiskey, right, for American whiskey. But even in Scotch, like blended Scotch has gotten a really bad rap because essentially in the 1970s, 80s, around the world, there's a crazy crash of whiskey. And in Scotland, essentially the blenders, like blends like Chivas Regal, Johnny Walker, J&B, Dewar's, they've been around forever. They own a lot of the single malt houses, and essentially blends combine single malts together. Single malts are just a production of one distillery, has to be made from 100% malted barley, has to be produced in Scotland, aged in Scotland, bottled if it's on its own. A few other rules, but basically a blend takes these different single malts, combines them together with something called grain whiskey, essentially whiskey made in a column still, which is very close to our way in America for high efficient column still, and then it's aged, right? I mean, that's a blend, right? They're all these aged whiskeys put together. That was Scotch up until really the end of the 1900s. So like in our lifetimes, we've seen the switch from blended Scotch to single malts, and was necessitated because this crash happened. The blenders were said to the single malts, we don't need any more. Our warehouses are full. People are slowing down on their whiskey drinking. And the single malt distillers were like, oh my God, we have one client and now they don't want our whiskey. What do we do? So they had to reinvent themselves as a product for consumers to bottle it. So they had to create their own identity, differentiating one from another and introducing themselves to consumers who largely didn't know anything about single malt. And the way that they got consumers to drink single malt was by denigrating blends, by saying people in Scotland only drank single malt. Only rubes drink, blends. Blends are for dummies. Like if you really want to drink whiskey, you should drink single malt. And it was so effective that people are convinced that blended Scotch is not good. But in reality, it's very, very good. And it, usually checks most of the boxes that most people want. Super mixable, smooth, not particularly smoky, like wonderful on ice or with club soda or with ginger ale. Like it's everything that you want from a Scotch that everybody who's always drinking single malt is like, oh, it's too powerful, too much flavor. Like it doesn't work with mixers. Because basically, essentially a single malt, it's like blends are like the Beatles, right? It's a group. Single malts, it's like when every Beatle recorded their own album. So yeah, you might like John Lennon's album. You might like Paul McCartney's album. Do you like Ringo's album? Maybe, maybe not. You know what I mean? But together, there's just enough Ringo and the Beatles, right? So that's what a blend is. A blend is like an orchestra. A single malt is like a soloist, right? But we've convinced ourselves that blends aren't good. And in fact, they're wonderful and they're totally undervalued. And if you go to a liquor store today, your money will go a lot farther if you buy blended Scotch than single malt Scotch, which is kind of crazy. I mean, look, sometimes I want something like Oban, right? It's beautiful flavor, right? But a lot of times I want Johnny Walker, right? Or Dewar's, like on the rocks or with club soda. So it's, again, I mean, I think there's a lot more value in the liquor store than people realize.
So as a Beatles fan, I'm going to choose to ignore your slight of Ringo.
Look, I like the Bonzo Dog Band. I'm not saying, but not a lot of people don't.
You leave Ringo alone? All right. But I think you touched on something, pretty important here, right? Because I think marketing does play a big role in the whole space, right? Especially when the hipsters get involved and they take a bottle of Blanton's from $30 to 150, right? So I'm going to put you on the spot again, because that's what I like to do. In your opinion, mine is Blanton's. What is the most overpriced bottle of whiskey and why?
Wow. Where do I begin?
I'm
like, I've been waiting for somebody to ask. No, I think Blanton's is a fabulous whiskey at $35. And if anything, I've seen price coming down a little bit, but I was shocked that it went from $35 to $200 a bottle, seemingly overnight, right?
Yep.
And even the first time I noticed was in New Orleans. I was down for Tales of the Cocktail, which is the big industry event in July. I went to a liquor store and they had a 175 of Weller for $50, right? Which I wish I had bought at the time. I looked up and Bland's was $200. I was like, why is Bland so expensive? And they're like, we can't get it. And I came back to New York and I called Park Avenue Liquor Shop, which is one of the best liquor stores in the country. And I said, I asked Jonathan, the co-owner, I said, Jonathan, do you have Bland's? How much is? He's like, I haven't been able to get Bland's in months, years. That's why it's so expensive. And I was like, wow, it's a great whiskey. Would I pay $200 for it? No. Would I pay $35? Absolutely. I think you also have a lot of whiskey companies or brands. You'd get these so-called craft distillers. I'm not saying all craft distillers, but some of them, where you'd roll up at a tasting and they'd be like, oh, when did you guys open? 2 years ago. All right, amazing. But you have a 10-year-old rye. Didn't you just say you opened 2 years ago? Yeah. And they will have bought their whiskey from MGP in Indiana. And again, there's no shame in sourcing whiskey, right? There's a giant distillery in Indiana that sells a lot to small brands, big brands. Everybody buys from MGP, or not everybody, but a lot of folks. No shame in that, right? But I do find it very, very annoying when people are buying stuff from MGP and then they're selling it for $150 a bottle, right? Where you're like, come on. I know it didn't cost that much to, you know what I mean? And I get that sometimes, look, there's a lot of costs, big debts building a new distillery from scratch, right? A lot of upfront overhead costs. That's why these whiskeys cost so much. But as a consumer, you're like, I'm paying $70 for a 2 or a 4-year-old rye that you got from MGP. I could buy a bottle of your Bullet Rye for what, $30? Rittenhouse for $20?
$38. It's perfect.
Right, which is maybe even a better bottle. It's certainly better than a 2-year-old whiskey, which is the minimum to be called really whiskey in my book. But I'd say 6 years, 4 to 6 years is ideal. 2 is you're just getting to become whiskey, right? So yeah, there are a lot of brands like that where you're like, this is a beautiful bottle, it's a beautiful label, it's a great story, but you're buying the whiskey from somebody else, you're marking it up crazy high. The other brand that I would say, which might get me in some trouble, is that this craze over Pappy Van Winkle too is insane, right? Where, the suggested retail price of some of these bottles is $150 and then they sell for $5,000. And you're like, come on. I've had my share of Pappy. Is it a good whiskey? Yes. Great whiskey.
Yeah.
Is it better than, will you like it more than a bottle that you've bought for $50? Or that's not a guarantee, right? People are like, what does it taste like? I'm like, it tastes like whiskey. And also, to be honest, for a long time, Pappy Van Winkle, the man, his whiskey that he made was Old Fitzgerald, right? At Stitzel Weller. He passed away. His family sold the distillery to Norton Simon, the industrialist. I go through it all in the book, but basically it goes through multiple hands. Now, Stitzel Weller itself hasn't run in decades, is sort of like a living monument, right? You can go and visit. So it's well, what is Pappy Van Winkle then? So basically his descendants decided to create a brand, but since they'd sold off their main brand, they had this other brand that was close to their own name. His name was Julian Van Winkle. They had Old Rip Van Winkle, which at some point they bought that name but never really used. They decided to, okay, we're going to reboot the brand and we're going to buy whiskey. They've since they sold Stitzel Weller or Old Fitzgerald, they've never had their own distillery. So for many years, they were just buying whiskey on the open market, right? So each vintage was different from the next. Now, Buffalo Trace, which makes Buffalo Trace, Blanton's, Weller, E.H. Taylor, at their distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky, they also make Pappy Van Winkle, right? There's a long way of saying, I mean, Buffalo Trace makes fabulous whiskey. I've no problems with what they're making as Pappy Van Winkle, but to spend $5,000 on a bottle of whiskey, I mean, that's a car.
Totally aggressive.
I mean, I would rather buy, I don't know what, like, how many cases of Buffalo Trace bourbon could you buy for $5,000? Probably many, right? I mean, it's like a $25 bourbon and it's wonderful, right? They have to charge a lot of money for them because they are rare, but it doesn't mean that you have to drink them, right? I mean, you can buy other whiskeys, many more bottles of said whiskey. If I was going to splurge, I'd rather spend $400 on a bottle of, or $200 on a bottle of, like the Michter's 10-year-old bourbon or rye. I mean, that's such a wonderful whiskey that tastes unlike most other bourbons or rye. The depths of the flavor, they don't take any shortcuts. They make it in a truly old-fashioned way. I think people lose sight of the forest through the trees, right? Like, seeing whiskey as an investment vehicle, I think, is very dangerous because it's like Beanie Babies. Like, it's not FDIC insured, right? You buy a $10,000 bottle of whiskey, it's only worth what somebody's going to pay for it, right? And in a lot of markets, it's not that easy also to sell like vintage bottles. It's gotten easier over the years. That's a whole other episode of this show. But the fact is that, like, it's like buying art. Like, to bank on this as an investment, I think, is a very risky proposition, right? It's a gamble, where I think it's a lot more fun if you're buying whiskey for your enjoyment, right? And you plan to actually drink it, hopefully with friends and family, right? And enjoy it together. Like, that makes a lot more sense to me. And if you look at it that way, like, why are we buying, a $10,000 bottle of whiskey or I guess if you can afford to, like, throw out $50,000 bottles of whiskey like rice.
Nobody on this podcast, I can promise you that. No,
right. And all power to you.
I will sell my Beanie Baby collection, and I will be able to do that.
Right.
Thank you very much.
So Noah, like, kind of off of that, right? So as someone who's looking for how to get some good quality stuff kind of sneaking in, because I remember the days when Blanton's was very, very reasonable and easily obtainable. I'm always kind of trying to follow what's the next best thing to hook onto. And I discovered Japanese whiskey, and Hibiki, was delighted with that, and then kind of priced myself out of that one. The latest that I've got, folks have told me, like, hey, you need to start trying Indian whiskey. And I know in the book you mentioned a couple of producers there. Like, do you have any notes for me? You're going to direct me in the right direction?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've been the early adopter on all these trends, right? I mean, I still have, like,
top marks.
The Hibiki 12. Dork. I'm like, is this the name of the podcast? Oh, sorry. I mean, the Hibiki 12, was incredible whiskey when it debuted, like, in America. Yeah. And it was like, I'm not talking about, this was like 12 years ago, give or take, right? Mm-hmm. And it was like $30 a bottle. And I kicked myself for not buying cases and cases of it when I could, because it's now gone. The Indian whiskey, I think they're, like, in America right now, they're basically two main brands that you can get. Amrut, which is very, very good, and Paul John. I think they're both based in Goa, in India. Like, basically everywhere where whiskey is made around the world, the one rule that we can all agree upon, the one constant, is it has to be made from grain, right? Whether we're talking about America, Canada, Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales, doesn't matter. The one thing around the world that we can agree upon, whiskey has to be made from grain. India, that is not traditionally true. They have made some whiskey from molasses, right? Which happened also in Scotland in the 1800s. But, like, essentially, to be called whiskey in most parts of the world, it has to be from grain. In India, some whiskeys are still made from molasses, but this new era of whiskey, like the Amruts and the Paul Johns, all usually are, like, those are all grain whiskeys, right? So they kind of they fit the standard definition of whiskey. Those two are the main companies that you'll see in America now. Some other ones are starting to come to the U.S., But I think you're right. It's like, I mean, again, I think it's super exciting because so much of the reason why whiskey tastes the way that it does is because of where it's made. And obviously, the wine folks like to use the word terroir, which, whatever. I mean, it just basically means place, right? It's that, like, in America, we have really hot summers, right? And in a lot of places, it's hot all year round in America. And it's humid. And as a result, when our whiskey ages, it gets higher in strength, right? It's the water that evaporates. In Scotland, it's like 60 degrees in the summer, right? So it loses strength over time. You also realize that's why people in Scotland don't drink whiskey with ice, because it's 60 degrees. Who the hell needs ice when it's 50, 60 degrees? Go to like Las Vegas or Phoenix or California or New York or New Orleans in the July or August, and it's over 100 degrees. Yeah, you're going to want ice in that whiskey, right? So again, and it's also the type of grain, right? Where the grain comes from, how the grain's grown. Even whiskeys, Scotch, the peated whiskeys use something called peat, which is essentially, all of these things like leaves and grass, like breaking down, right? And there's very few trees. It's not like America, right, where we can just cut down a tree and have a wood burning stove. There's no charcoal is very expensive. There was no trees to really cut down. So they started to realize that this peat, this decaying organic matter, could be cut out. It looks like mud, but it can be cut into bricks, aged and burned like charcoal. But it gives off this super smoke essentially. And that's what infuses those whiskeys like Kalila and Ardbeg and
Loveland, right?
yeah, Ardbeg, yeah, all these things, right? So it's these amazing flavors that infuse into the grain. So that's all, again, local. So, what's amazing is that, in India, the climate's completely different, right? It's totally different in Southeast Asia. So that creates all their types of flavor profiles. They're pulling in all their own local traditions and stuff. So it's amazing. I mean, I think that's the amazing thing about whiskey is that, like, it doesn't all just taste the same, right? It's not like if you made this bottle of Bullet single malt in Scotland, it would taste different. If you made Oban in America, it would taste different. Even if you use the same ingredients and the same yeast, it's like there's so many variables, even though there is only essentially 3 ingredients in whiskey. It's just water, yeast, and grain, right? I like to say there's a 4th ingredient that nobody talks about, which is the barrel, because alcohol is a solvent, so it's breaking down the wood, pulling in all of these flavor compounds from the oak. It's not just a container, right? It's actually part of the whiskey. All whiskey goes into the barrel clear. The color comes from the wood, right? And also up to 80% of the flavor, depending upon who you ask. And also that exchange of air allows the flavor compounds inherent in the spirit to evolve over time. You also have water in the barrel. Some of these things in the barrel are water soluble, some of the flavor compounds. Some are alcohol soluble. So you want both of those things. You want a lower barrel entry proof, which is also, if we're going to get really nerdy about things, that is one of the things that people debate now. Where back in the day, the whiskey would go into the barrel like roughly around 100 proof, right? And that would mean essentially you're proofing it down by adding water before it goes in the barrel. So you'd need more barrels, more warehouses, and you get fewer bottles at the end, right? Where other folks now, like at a certain point, the barrel entry proof limit was raised so that you'd need fewer barrels, fewer warehouses, and you could add more water after it's done aging. This is all in America. But like one shorthand, if you're really nerdy about things, folks like Michter's, Leopold Brothers, my buddy Todd Leopold out in Denver, all believe that a lower barrel entry proof, closer to 100, makes better whiskey. And to be honest, given what the whiskeys that these people make, Wild Turkey too, it is better. Like it is a better, lower barrel entry proof. So again, I mean, there are all these like things that, all these like variables, and the more you get into it, these are things that are shorthand. I would say also for you, Michael, like looking for the word bottled in bond. like there's a lot of stuff on labels that mean not a lot. Small batch, for instance. Your small batch may be very small. My small batch may be 500,000 liters. Like, I don't know. Like, there's no definition, right?
That's a very personal question, by the way.
Right.
Just
Sorry.
At least you said it, Mike. At least you said it.
It's rhetorical. Sorry. But bottled in bond comes from the 1897 Bottled in Bond Act. It's one of the few things that both sides of Congress were able to agree upon. But basically, in the 1800s, a lot of the whiskey that was being sold and drunk was actually imitation whiskey. It was essentially like neutral grain spirit, flavored and colored with all types of delicious things like creosote and burnt like nut shells and all types of weird stuff. And if you look in like old cocktail books, there's often like an appendix for how to make whiskey. And it's like, start with like vodka, neutral grain spirit, and you're going to add so much of this and so much of that. And then you get whiskey, right? And that's not...
It's not okay. It's not okay.
So basically, the distillers were angrier than Brendan is about this situation. Yes. Like folks like E.H. Taylor, and the chief chemist of the country was this guy named Dr. Wiley. And they were outraged, and they started like basically pushing for regulations.
I can 100% nerd out on this with you all day because I am a whiskey lover, right? I wouldn't say I'm a connoisseur. I'm not going to say I don't have a sophisticated palate, right? Like you said earlier, but we are a history podcast. So we have to ask at least one question about history, right? If you could go back in time in a time machine and you could talk to anybody that has anything to do with whiskey whatsoever, who would it be and why?
Am I going to be honest? Like, I have thought about this question more than once, right? Because like I feel like I live for free. Like, you know, in certain time periods writing this book, right? There are several folks, like one, Pappy Van Winkle, right? Because I have many questions about actually what Old Fitzgerald was, because everybody thinks it's wheated bourbon. I suspect it's not the only thing he made or exactly what he made. And nobody, as I can find out, ever asked him, like point blank, like, what are you making? Like, what is the recipe, right? So that would be like amazing to ask him about like what they were actually doing at Stitzelwell or Old Fitzgerald. E.H. Taylor, also a fascinating person who, you know, Colonel E.H. Taylor is a brand name for him now, but, you know, he was one of the people who was pushing for really only things like that we would call whiskey would be called whiskey, none of the imitation stuff. He and Dr. Harvey Wiley, who was the chief chemist of the U.S., it would be amazing to meet both of them and talk to them about like what was going on. To be honest, you know, one of my grandfathers was like, you know, had a bar in his living room that was always, you know, it was full of whiskey. Like he passed away when I was like pretty young. It would be pretty cool to go back now. Like I think that he would have been pretty delighted with my career path and access to a river of alcohol. He probably would have loved that. It would have been nice to over a fine meal, drink all these fine whiskeys. So that would be a kind of cool thing to do together.
So now, Noah, doing a book like this, as you talked about, it's years of sitting there and just diving into this specific stuff. But you said yourself, you're a history nerd. So do you get time to read history nonfiction for fun? Do you have favorite authors? Or do you have a friend whose book's coming out and you want to give him a plug right now for everybody listening?
I'd say, you know, my buddy David Wondrich, we worked on the Oxford Companions together. We used to do a podcast there called Life Behind Bars. It wasn't about prison. It was about bartenders, very confusing to a lot of people. That was fun. But he has a new book, which is the comic book history of the cocktail, which is a graphic novel. So that's kind of cool. Nobody's really, as weird as it sounds, nobody's actually tackled the history of the cocktail like in that depth. Obviously, growing up reading like all of the Robert Caro books, his books about Robert Moses in New York, you know, The Power Broker. He has one that he wrote in his spare time in between writing his multi-volume book about LBJ, about like research and history, and, you know, the idea that like you've got to turn every page, like, you know, just sort of the process, which I mean, is definitely true. Every time I thought with the Whiskey Bible, like, oh, I'm just going to take a shortcut here. Like, I'm just going to see what the old Google has to say about this. Invariably, it's the same old chestnuts, right? And most of that stuff was created by Don Draper in a boardroom on Madison Avenue to sell booze. And we fell for it hook, line, and sinker. And at some point, we confused marketing taglines with actual historical research. And, once you start looking into things for this book, like a lot of this was, oh, let me just cite whatever that book that everybody talks about. Like, let me just see what it actually says about Irish whiskey. And then 2 weeks later, you're like mind's blown because that book, in this case, the Red Book of Ossory, which sounds like something from Game of Thrones, but it's actually covered in red vellum, was written hundred years ago. It really has very little to do with whiskey. And, totally upended my thoughts about, everybody cites the Red Book of Ossory as the fact that Ireland was making whiskey before Scotland. And it's just taken that's it. Like, nobody's ever checked. Nobody's looked into this. Like, I don't know who came up with this idea. So after weeks and weeks of searching, it turns out the Red Book of Ossory is actually like a religious text. It's written in Latin. It's hymns. I have a copy, right? I finally tracked down a used copy that somebody translated in, I think, the 60s or 70s. I'm like, what the hell is this? This has nothing to do with whiskey. Why do we even? So finally, I found an academic article from the late 1800s about the Red Book of Ossory. Turns out that, the hand that wrote it was probably the Archbishop of Kilkenny, Ireland. Okay. There's like a note about it's the Latin for, essentially about wine. The first, kind of like logical jump is that there are no grapes in Ireland. So they're really talking about grain. So they must be talking about making whiskey. You're like, okay, I mean, maybe. But then, I was reading about Kilkenny, and I've been to Ireland many times. So I don't know anything about Kilkenny. And it turned out that it was a stronghold of the English when they took over Ireland. So you're like, wait, what? And the Archbishop himself was English, and it's in the church's possession today. So, okay, so if this is a book written by an Englishman that has a note in the margins, because it's kind of used, I guess people wrote notes in this book, probably somebody who was English who wrote this note about distilling. So does that mean that this knowledge about distilling whiskey actually first came from England, which is not the conclusion that anybody wants, right? Or is looking for, right? And you're like, oh God, what did I stumble upon? Like, oh my God, like what the hell is happening? Like, I've now lost sight of the horizon here, right? So yeah, I mean, you have all these crazy things that obviously, I could only go so far for some of these answers, right? And it's just like, wow, the real history of booze, of whiskey and cocktails is like far different than what we really collectively thought it was. And that's essentially what separates the Whiskey Bible from a lot of whiskey books that have been published in the last, 30 years, is that I actually went back and double checked a lot of these stories, and they turn out to be total myths, legends, and nonsense, right? They don't really hold up. And I did find a lot of the truth, which, to be honest, was often not romantic, but it's the reality. Back in the day, now, Macallan talks about how it has the smallest stills in Scotland, which obviously the whiskey reflects that, or Glenmorangie is the tallest. But back in the day, it was probably because everybody bought their stills used. Like Anthony Bourdain would always tell people, you're opening a restaurant, don't buy new restaurant equipment. Your pots and pans are going to be dented and burnt soon enough, so might as well just buy dented and burnt stuff. Save you a ton of money. Somebody's always going to have business buy their stuff. Same thing. All of these distillers, when they open, were buying used stills. So who knows, Macallan, why do they have such small stills? Maybe that's all they could afford. Maybe the barn that they had was one story or had a particularly low ceiling, right? But over the last 200 years, we've given it this very romantic twist, where in reality, the real history is way more practical. The reason why Irish whiskey is made from malted and unmalted barley is because at a certain point, the distillers were being taxed on how much barley they were using. So they were being crafty and smart, and they were like, fine, You're going to tax us on how much malted barley we use? We'll use malted and unmalted, dummies. We've just cut our tax bill in half, right? But that's become over time a hallmark of like essentially of Irish whiskey and Irish whiskey distilling practices, but it has a very, very practical reason. And that was a lot of the stuff that I found for the Whiskey Bible. It's just that like so much of the stuff that we think of now has this very, very romantic, stories attached to it. It's incredibly practical. Usually had to do with things like taxation, regulations, war, all of these like major things. And you realize like, okay, alcohol, but whiskey in particular is one of these things that shapes the modern world, right? It's one of these forces that literally changes society and culture and the way that we live. And we never think about it that way. We only think about it as like a beverage, but it's really this incredible force that like reorganizes our world.
Noah, it reorganized the podcast for this episode. Thank you so much for
My pleasure.
The delivery. It's definitely spiced this up a ton, and I really, really appreciate it. And so some people think the history is boring, nonfiction is boring. They may not even like whiskey, and they may say, no, why would I read this book? What would you tell someone like that to get them on the right path so they could enjoy this as much as we've all enjoyed it?
Well, I would say anything like through the lens of whiskey is way more interesting, right? And especially if reading this book, I mean, obviously, I would, of course, recommend that as you're reading it, that you sip on a glass of whiskey, right? I mean, when you're reading about something, obviously, you should be enjoying it. So for most people, if you told them about history, but connected to whiskey, it's suddenly completely different, right? It's super exciting, I hope. The stories are fascinating. I mean, that's what drew me to do this project. I mean, obviously I enjoy drinking whiskey, but in all seriousness, like learning about the people and the places that make the whiskey satisfy me in a way that like drinking the whiskey can't, right? And that only amplifies my enjoyment of what's in the glass.
Well, Noah, listen, it's fantastic. Thank you, first of all, for the booze. We do need to shut this down before Barnett completely passes out.
Too late.
Noah, listen, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for the booze. And we're going to tell everybody to go buy this.
Thank you.
And that's it for this episode. Noah, thank you so much. The Whiskey Bible. I mean, come on, everybody. You got to have somebody in your family that this is the perfect stocking stuffer for. They're going to love it. Go out and get it. In the meantime, hit us up Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget the YouTube channel. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.